Good afternoon, everybody. This is William with the Fincastle Underground. Today is October 18th, 2018. It's about 3:30 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, and I'm here with a very special guest today, one of the hot up-and-coming film directors. I'm totally serious about that I'm very privileged to have been able to wrangle onto the show, Mr. Brendon Marotta. He's an award-winning filmmaker who's based out of Austin, Texas, who's been making films since he was 14 years old. Brendon graduated from the University of North Carolina School of the Arts Film School to work as a professional film editor. His work as an editor has premiered at the Austin Film Festival, where it won the Narrative Feature Audience Award. American Circumcision is his first feature-length documentary as director. We welcome him today. Welcome, Brendon. I'm very glad that you're here.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so I have a very unique audience here, and I was lucky enough to get an advanced screening of the film, which you kindly sent to me. We're going to do this interview about a month ago before my lightning mishap here with my computer system. But I was very excited to be one of the first people to see your film. And I think I remember exactly what I told you. As soon as I saw it, I said, Brendon, you've made a classic film here. And I truly believe that. I know you've worked on it for a number of years. And honestly, I've been thinking about it, and it's come out at the exact perfect time, because the world would not have been ready for this prior to everything that's been going on with politics, all the revelations of corruption in government and private industry and things like that. This film is very, very timely. And I think people now at this moment in history can actually understand what it is you've brought to the table. Why this documentary? Why did you make this documentary, American Circumcision?
So the film's about the modern circumcision debate. And I think a lot of people perceive circumcision as a sort of fringe issue or something they're not familiar with. It seems kind of weird or different. But if I told you there was another issue that affected every man in America, every partner of a man, every parent and child, in the most personal way possible, and we'd never had a national conversation about it, no one had ever done a documentary of this scale about it, you think, well, that seems pretty important. Like, an issue that affects everyone in America is something we should talk about. And yet, circumcision intersects with all of our biggest taboos. It involves sex and politics and religion. It involves your family and your culture. It involves, medicine and all these large institutions. And it involves them in the most personal way possible. It's not like an issue that's out there in the world. It's your body or your sexuality or your sexual partners. So because it affects people on such a personal level and involves all these taboos, we often don't talk about it publicly. And also because it involves the genitals and sexuality in the body, we don't see it. We don't interact with it on a daily basis, even though, it is literally marked in your flesh if it's something that's been done to you. So I felt like the things that I had learned about this issue were so important, I had to bring them to a larger audience. And that, like you said, there's a lot of things that our culture has not had a conversation about that we're now able to have a conversation about because we're able to talk to one another without the mediators of these large cultural institutions, these, things that have a lot of money and maybe financial interest in us not talking about certain things.
Right. That's why I enjoy my platform here on YouTube, not to interrupt you. It is a vast topic. It can be studied academically from any angle. You could spend a lifetime researching just a tiny aspect of this, and you've managed to condense it all into a very concise film. One of the things that my audience is particularly interested in here is a lot of the things you've talked about, how big institutions have conspired together, and it's more evident than ever. It used to be sort of on a fringe. Just this very way of thinking was on the fringe. But my audience, anybody that would watch a channel like mine, is very suspicious about the social systems that control people's lives, up to and including doctors. And up until in my lifetime, in my youth, even into my teenage years, a doctor was God. You couldn't question doctors. It's only now recently where people have become more educated. They're like, these doctors are just people, and 50% of them graduated in the lower half of their class, and I have the internet now. So maybe you could bring together, as best you can, I know you have a talent for this, how these major institutions have turned circumcision, which started out as a Jewish ritual in antiquity, modernized it here in America, and just exactly what it is, to define some terms for my audience who may not be familiar with it.
Sure. So, like you said, I think people now realize that there is a financial incentive for a lot of the things that doctors do. And a lot of Americans think that circumcision is something that everyone in the world has always done. And in reality, it's only been a religious practice among Jews and Muslims and certain African tribes and tribal initiations around the world until the last 100 years. And in the Victorian era, it was believed by doctors that masturbation was the cause of many social and moral ills. It was unhygienic, it was bad, it caused disease. And so they thought, we can cure masturbation by removing the most sensitive part of the body, the foreskin. And so circumcision actually began as a medical practice in America as a cure for masturbation, which sounds absurd to us now, but in the Victorian era, it was seen that sexuality was somehow harmful and bad. And as birth moved from midwives and home birth to hospitals, circumcision became something that the doctors could charge for.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became a standard practice for hospitals because it was something they could add in the money. Up until recently, hospitals would give a blanket consent form that said, we're going to do what we want to the baby, and you just agreed to do, whatever we think is best. And so there wasn't even consent for circumcision. And so the fact they could add that extra amount of money on meant that it was a thing that they were going to practice and do. So the whole history of circumcision is kind of strange in and of itself, the way that it's been marketed. So for example, if you look prior to the 1960s, it was commonly accepted that circumcision reduced sexual sensation, and that was part of the marketing for it, because you don't want your child being one of these like degenerate, over-sexualized people.
Right.
And then after the sexual revolution, it was thought, well, sexuality is a good thing. We all should love our bodies, and, feeling pleasure is good. And that piece of marketing just disappeared. And then it became, well, there's no sexual difference between, if you're circumcised or you're not. And that the people would then, the marketing shifted, and now the foreskin has no sexual value, right?
Well, as you should, not to interrupt again, but as you show in your film quite eloquently, the foreskin does have sexual value. It's a great human tragedy, and I mean that in every way, for men who are victims of this procedure. And as you talk about infants, it's only, when you were speaking about blanket consent forms, it's only recently that people have really started caring about children. I know that sounds absurd, but some of my viewers may not be familiar with the fact that they were performing open heart surgery on children without anesthetic because they believed up until the mid-1980s that children couldn't feel pain. That's in my lifetime, your lifetime. And now there's been, everybody's heard for years, all these missing and exploited children. It's only now in the past 2 years that the collective consciousness is focusing on all these child sex trafficking rings and pedophilia. That's why I say that your film is more timely than ever. There's millions of missing children. People are starting to finally question that. And I'm hoping, as you are, that your film will make people start questioning the very real, almost industrial grade genital mutilation that we perform on our own boys here in America.
Right. I think a lot of the time people will focus on potential abuses to children that might be happening in the shadows. So like maybe there's an evil group of people somewhere who are engaged in a conspiracy to harm children. Meanwhile, the majority of children in America, their first sexual experience, if you will, is someone holding them down and cutting into their genitals and removing the most sensitive part, often without anesthesia. Because like you said, doctors used to think that babies didn't feel pain, and they just, there's children who are screaming in pain, screaming so hard sometimes their lungs burst and they actually have injuries from how hard they're screaming. They'll just say, well, he's just exercising his lungs, he doesn't feel anything, it doesn't matter. So I think very often people will focus on the potential hidden conspiracy and miss the open, commonly accepted conspiracy, the commonly accepted institution. And we were talking about institutions earlier. Now that we have greater access to information, and there's more people questioning circumcision, these institutions that have pushed it are in a difficult spot. So groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has released policy statements in favor of circumcision, people in the CDC, or people who are involved in circumcision programs in Africa, they're in a position now where if they admit that they were wrong, or if they say that they were wrong, they might be legally liable for that. So, I mean, if you think about how big a potential medical malpractice lawsuit is, imagine that multiplied over every man in America. That's huge. That would bankrupt them. And so,
Absolutely. And you know what's the most dystopian thing about it, and I truly mean dystopian, is that I've been around this issue. You and I have worked together in the past. Is that so often you hear men say almost instantaneously, without any thought, "I'm circumcised and I'm fine." And this terrifies me, especially with my background as a sociologist, that you could normalize a scenario where parents will willingly turn their child over for genital mutilation to be conducted largely without anesthesia for the majority of the history that it was performed, um, to mutilate that child's genitals where he will never be whole again. It fundamentally changes the functionality of the penis and the experience of the nervous system for both men and women. Um, and then the child will grow up, will repeat the cycle, and then they'll say, "Well, I'm circumcised, I'm fine." It's a good thing that powers that be held me down and cut off part of my penis. In fact, you'd get them to say that they're happy about it. There's many pro-circumcision people, and even those that are taking it a step further to promote female circumcision. I know we've covered a lot, so just pick up where.
yeah, there's a lot in there. But
It is.
when you hear men say, "I'm fine with it," I always want to ask why. Like, what about your foreskin displeased you?
Mm.
And when you frame it that way, it's like, oh, well, I never knew. It's like, okay, well, how do you know? Like, to me, this statement, "I'm fine with it," is often better translated as, I don't want to feel bad about it, and I'm afraid of not feeling okay with it. I'm afraid of not feeling fine with it. Because what does it mean if you don't feel fine about your sexuality in some way? There's a lot to unpack and explore there. And actually, it's funny. I made I saw a meme recently. It was one of these sort of NPC memes that are going around the internet.
Right.
It was someone saying, "I'm fine with my circumcision," and the response is, "Why?" And then they just sort of like, they get the angry NPC face of like, I think when people talk about circumcision, they have these sort of programmed cultural responses of, "Well, I'm fine with it," or "I heard it's better," or "I heard it's cleaner." And when you ask them to unpack those on any level, like, what do you mean cleaner? What about your sexuality and your body was unclean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that meme actually goes all the way back to the Victorians and this idea of, that the sexuality is somehow dirty. But
Right.
people will use that in a modern context, not realizing they're talking about their sexuality as unclean in some way.
It's worth pointing out when you say Victorian era, you're talking about the late 1800s,
Correct.
the 80s, 1890s. And I think my audience would be quite interested to know, if they haven't figured it out already, the founding fathers of our America, there were foreskins flown under this flag behind me. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had their foreskins. I would imagine, as did any other founding father that there was there. This is truly uniquely modern. I mean, the 1890s was 150 years ago.
Right. And even then, it wasn't really universal until hospital birth became almost universal. And hospital birth, too, has changed a lot. I mean, it used to be women would go in and they would give birth under full anesthesia.
Mm-hmm.
So they wouldn't even remember their birth. And men were expected to wait outside while their wife gave birth. The hospital sort of presented birth as something that the doctor did for the woman, as opposed to the natural thing that every woman on the planet does, and it's her body, and that she's the one doing this, and the doctor is just there to assist.
Right. I'd like to take this time. I do book recommendations here on this channel sometimes. They're on my bookshelf. I'm not going to go get them right now. But anybody that's interested in childbirth, very extensive aspects of childbirth done in a very poetic way. Michel Odent is a French author, an obstetrician. He wrote a book called The Farmer and the Obstetrician that compares industrialized farming to industrialized childbirth here in America, particularly, and also a book called The Caesarean. And he deals with these. See, this is exactly the whole point of the Fincastle Underground. At this point in history, people are becoming self-actualized. They don't trust these institutions anymore. Nobody believes. The government is basically defunct as far as trust goes. The university system is a joke. I don't think people have trusted the medical community for a long time, but they've kind of they felt trapped into it. Like, well, my body is prone to fail, and I'm going to have to go to a hospital, and I am going to have to entrust doctors. And now people are finding out, no, there are preventative ways to stay far away from hospitals, and we can, in fact, maintain our own health. So it's a whole shift of a paradigm shift.
Right. Even the paradigm of circumcision is kind of strange. So people will use the term uncircumcised to describe intact men, but like you wouldn't call a woman unmastectomied. You wouldn't say that you're like unamputated because you have all your limbs. There's a lot of things you're So we sort of frame circumcision as normal with our language, when in reality we call, the terminology used for a woman is intact, whole, natural.
Right.
And I think even the frame of circumcision is somehow that your body is inherently problematic and in need of fixing. So how boys are born in need of surgery and surgical fixing, that their sexuality is somehow wrong and has to be corrected by an adult. And in reality, European nations, they will just say you just leave that body part alone and we don't really have any problems with it throughout the whole man's life, Even things that American doctors will say, oh, well, you'll need to get circumcised later in life for, European doctors know that there are non-surgical simple cures for, because they're used to treating that body part. Whereas in America, American doctors have not seen the foreskin in a long time. They're not trained. I mean, many medical textbooks only say the foreskin is the part removed in circumcision, and they don't define it beyond that. They don't say what this body part is for or what its structures are.
The part is defined by the surgery in the medical text.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to, like, they don't even know that there's different parts to the foreskin. There's the ridge band and the frenulum and all these things. And so they don't know how to treat it.
Well, it's interesting. You say the European the European doctors would treat it. The Japanese or any Asian, anyone else in the world. Because if you suggested we're going to circumcise your foreskin, we're going to circumcise your penis and remove your foreskin, in their mind, it would be as if someone came to an American man and said, hey, we're going to cut off your whole dick. They're not willing to part with their foreskin once they've grown up with it and experienced the massive amount of pleasure. And you don't have to concede to this or not, Brendon, but a lot of people that watch my channel, there seems to be a rather concerted war on masculinity, a war on boys in America. I don't know if you share this view or not, but circumcision is it's literally an industrialized emasculation surgery. I know from my own research that there's particular unique types of male hormones produced in the foreskin that are not produced in the testicles or anywhere else in the body. So instantaneously, there's a hormonal imbalance in the young infant.
I think if the reverse were true, if we circumcised the majority of women in America and the profession doing it, nurses, was majority male, that there are certainly women's groups who would argue that there's a war on women. They would certainly push that narrative.
Oh, you'd never hear the end of it. You would never hear the end of it.
And yet, in America, we regularly do this to boys, and I think part of it is that the challenge is that men and masculinity is very much about being willing to sacrifice your personal comfort for the good of the tribe. So as men, we go to war and join the military. We put our comfort aside for that. We're the ones who are expected to be drafted. If you look at police and firefighters and things like that, those used to be majority male professions. Even in work, we're sort of expected to do difficult jobs and sacrifice our comfort in order to be, if you're looking at the traditional male role, the primary breadwinner and things like that. And so complaining, saying that I'm not okay with something, this makes me uncomfortable, is seen as a very unmasculine thing to do. Mm-hmm. When in reality, putting aside your personal comfort, the part of you that wants to feel emotionally safe, the part of you that is afraid to talk about difficult things, in order to do what's necessary to make sure the next generation is safe and healthy and loved and comes into this world in a way where they get to keep their whole body, is actually an incredibly masculine act, because you are acting as the protector for your future children.
Right. Well, it's very obvious that the media, it's unclear to me to what extent this is actually true, but the media has perverted American masculinity, distilled it down to Bud Light and NASCAR and just dumbass Beavis and Butthead type jokes. But I know men in my own life. I have certain circles of people, and that's not what masculinity is. There's a lot of people that are embracing that sort of protector role, that they want a better world to live in. They don't want to fall prey to all the excesses of modern society. They want to be powerful and strong, and they keep seeking knowledge and self-development and betterment. That's really what it's all about.
Right. Yeah. There's this, even with circumcision, there's this sort of double blind given to men of either you're fine with it, in which case you have to deny your feelings and say that somehow someone holding you down and cutting off part of your body is something that you're okay with, that you don't have a boundary there, or you have to be seen, speak out against it, in which case the media and public institutions will frame you as weak or, somehow unmasculine or insecure in your sexuality, or they'll say there's something wrong with you. They'll engage in essentially body shaming and bullying and all these things, which, on the surface, the mainstream will tell you they're against, but they're more than happy to engage against them, against men and against men who challenge their narrative.
Right. The third wave feminism's been ranting about the patriarchy for years and years. And I've heard more women than I can count that are aware tell me that in a patriarchal society, men are always the first victims. And they really appreciate it. They lose life and limb and wear your body down and die early, just to keep the machine going, working the mill.
Yeah, there's another mainstream narrative about men versus women, as opposed to that some of the roles we have created are in some way a trade-off for both sides. And I think that there's this idea of in the media, they sort of try to frame this as a zero-sum game, where if men get what they want, women are somehow harmed, or if women get what they want, then men are somehow harmed. As opposed to, like this issue, it's very clear, if men retain their whole body and sexuality, then they have more to give to the female partners they're with, and they're better able to protect their future children in any relationship they have with a woman. So
Right.
I don't see these things as zero sum. I think that the more, and in fact, one of my interview subjects has said, if one gender isn't safe, then neither gender is safe. And there have been attempts in America to push female circumcision, and the advocates of this will say, well, we circumcise boys, and that removes more tissue than female circumcision. Why shouldn't we be able to circumcise women? And this has been pushed by two different groups recently. There was a policy statement released by the American Academy of Pediatrics that was later very quickly retracted after media outrage, that basically said this. It said, female circumcision, type 1 female circumcision, is far less invasive than male circumcision, and we make money on male circumcision. Why shouldn't we be able to make money on female circumcision for parents who want that? And recently there was a case in Detroit where I believe it's a Muslim sect there, was practicing female circumcision. There was a doctor doing this, and they were caught. They were arrested, and now it's the first prosecution under the federal anti-FGM, anti-female genital mutilation law. And the defense, very interestingly, has managed to get Alan Dershowitz to defend them. And one of the things he said he's going to argue is that this type of female circumcision is far less invasive than male circumcision and is their religious right to practice. So,
Right.
So we're going to see in court eventually whether or not this argument stands.
Right. Well, that is you've mentioned the slippery slope here of religion. Now, circumcision, a lot of people, rightly so, tie in their minds to the Jewish community because it reaches back to antiquity. And you're saying the argument is now being made that we are allowing not only circumcision of basically any American boy, but also Jewish boys, that other people who feel they have a religious entitlement to circumcise their children, in this case women, they feel that they should be able to do it.
Even Jewish circumcision is not as ancient as you might think. So the type of circumcision that we practice now is actually not the type of circumcision that was practiced in the Bible and prior to the death of Christ. There was during the Hellenistic period, a couple hundred years after Jesus' death, there was there were many Jewish men who were the circumcision actually used to just be the removal of the very tip of the foreskin. So the foreskin, when the child is born, is actually fused to the glands of the penis. And in order to do the type of circumcision we do now, you have to break away that fusion, kind of like how your fingernail is fused to your finger. It's actually very painful for the child to break this away.
Right. And this is a good point to interject that doctors usually justify performing a circumcision because the foreskin won't retract. But Americans are so ignorant of anatomy, we can tell our audience here the foreskin's not supposed to retract, sometimes until even puberty.
Right. I mean, it's a natural part of the body. And part of the reason it doesn't retract is if you're, you haven't reached puberty, or if you're very young, you don't need to be using your body in that way sexually. You're not designed for that. It's a natural part of the child growing up.
Right. The clitoral hood wouldn't retract on an infant female, but nobody ever tries to forcibly rip it back.
Yeah. But this piece that was added, the breaking away of the foreskin, that didn't happen until later. And it happened because there were Jewish men who wanted to perform in Roman athletic games. And these games were traditionally done nude. And they, it was seen by the Romans, it was seen as very lewd to have the glands of your penis exposed. It would be like if you were to have a visible erection in these things. And
right.
The only reason someone would see that is if that happens. So Jewish men would take the remaining foreskin they had and clip it in front of their penis so that it covered that part of the body. And the Jewish elders did not like this. They thought this is supposed to be our tribal marker that differentiates us from other groups. So they changed circumcision during that period to, instead of removing just the very tip of the foreskin, to removing the entire foreskin, everything that covered the glands of the penis.
Right.
So the type that we practice now is not biblical circumcision. It is something new and radically more invasive.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand. So basically, they wanted to make it impossible for Jews to disguise themselves as Gentiles.
Right.
In the time period. Right. No, there's so much to it. It doesn't. But what I was getting at earlier is that there are people, because there have been efforts made to criminalize circumcision and make it illegal, most notably in San Francisco, of all places. But the argument is that it's a Jewish custom. We can't infringe on people's freedom of religion. And so now the Muslim community is making that argument that they have the freedom of religion to circumcise their daughters in a variety of different ways. As you mentioned earlier, there's different types of female circumcision. And in fact, I know from your film that you interviewed people that were actually big-time proponents of this. That's the one thing I have to say about your film. You got the best people on both sides, very highly credentialed people, very well-spoken people. This is truly a masterpiece. I can't say enough good things about your film. Where can you get it, by the way? I don't think we've told our audience that yet. Let's take a moment to talk about where they can find your film. And
sure.
I'm going to have a link to the trailer down in the description.
So you can find the film on circumcisionmovie.com. There's a link to all the different places you can get it. We are on Amazon and iTunes and Vimeo. We just recently expanded, so you can actually get it worldwide now. Not just in the United States. And you can also have it, we're now also on certain retail platforms. So if you go into Best Buy or Walmart or Target and you ask them to order you a copy, they will send a copy to you.
Okay.
So yeah, but circumcisionmovie.com has a link to all of that and everything you'd ever want to know about the film.
All right, I'm going to put all your credentials down in the description because the thing about my audience is they love researching. They love going through. I'm sure that this is, some of my audience may have heard this before, some of them haven't. We were talking about religious circumcision, though, and I wanted to address very quickly, because I have a number of Christians in my audience. There's a misconception, a gross misconception, that somehow being a Christian requires that you be circumcised because it was mentioned in the Bible in some fashion. Could you speak about that?
Right, yeah. So a lot of people will say, well, it's in the Bible, but they haven't looked at what context it's in the Bible in. In Galatians 5, the Apostle Paul calls circumcision a mutilation, and he says if you're doing it, you're denying your faith in Christ. The New Testament writers are very clear. Circumcision is not Christian, and not only is it not Christian, but doing it is a denial that Christ died for you. Because circumcision in the Old Testament was a blood sacrifice. It was, similar to how the Old Testament Jewish people would sacrifice animals, and they would sacrifice things at the temple. they would also sacrifice the most sensitive part of their progeny, who's, in charge. This is their son. This is the person who will carry on their line in their house and inherit all of their things. And so if you practice circumcision now as a Christian, you're practicing an Old Testament blood sacrifice. And in Christian theology, Christ was the last blood sacrifice. He died for everyone's sins. We're washed in his blood, as many Christian writers have said. And so it's very odd to see people say, well, it's in the Bible, because I think people have this idea, because it's in the Old Testament, well, even if we don't have to do it now, it's a good thing to do. But the New Testament writers are very clear that if you're trying to keep one part of the law, it's like trying to keep all of it. And this is not something that is in the Old Testament. It's not like one of the commandments that's just sort of a good thing to do. Like, it's not, I think many people look at the Old Testament law and they go, well, you're not supposed to lie or murder. And that sounds like even a good idea, even to secular people, right? Mm-hmm. That's pretty good rules for life. But this is very clearly in the Old Testament a blood sacrifice. It is you are causing harm to something or someone to punish it in place for your sins. And if you're punishing your child for your sins, then on some level you are telling God that Christ wasn't enough for you. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not only not something that Christians have to do. Circumcising your child is a denial of your faith in Christ. And that is the argument that many New Testament writers make. And throughout history, by the way, most of the historical church has felt the same way. Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, all the medieval Christian writers, they're all very clear that circumcision is not something that Christians do.
Right. And I've heard that from a number of theologians, not just you. This isn't an original idea that,
No, this has been written about a long time.
Right. I've never understood that. I've had this discussion with people too, about how Christ himself was the circumcision. He was the last blood sacrifice. And I don't think, with apologies to my Christian viewers, Christians are not famous for their open and honest discussions about sexuality in church. So it's probably like anything else that goes on behind the scenes. Nobody's really talking about it. I can't imagine a priest giving a sermon about circumcision. Unless you're Catholic, they did have the Feast of the Circumcision in January because Christ was circumcised because he was Jewish.
Right. And it's sort of, even the theology of that, it's seen as this is one of the trials that Christ had to go through for us. So like circumcision was really painful and he had to do that because he hadn't yet died for our sins. And it's sort of seen as, like on par with the fact that he died on a cross. So he went through this painful thing for us. And it would be almost as strange as if you were to say, well, crucifixion's in the Bible, so I'm going to tie my child up, I'm going to nail him to a cross, right? It's very strange from a theological standpoint. But as one of my interview subjects pointed out, American Christians are not just Christians, they're also Americans. And circumcision is seen as an American cultural custom. Mm-hmm. And so when people do this, I think that they are being very much of the world rather than of their faith. This is just what our culture does, right?
Right.
And so the fact that it's in the Bible is almost, again, it's like one of those sort of culturally programmed memes of like, well, I heard that, and that makes me feel good about it, and now I don't need to do the intellectual inquiry or the biblical study to actually know that context. But again, when you go one layer deeper, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Right. Well, one of the things you do with your film is go through the veil of big medicine. And see, there was so much secrecy in the medical community. Mothers had no idea what was going on to their children. Now that you can actually see how brutal and sadistic this is, it literally genital mutilation. There's no other word for that. An infant child, usually a day old, mutilating their genitals for profit. It doesn't, and I'd like to talk more about that in a second. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, though. Oh, about Jewish circumcision. What's interesting is that it didn't appear until the third revision of the Old Testament. It doesn't even date back as far, because there were various revisions of the Old Testament. And one of the things that I know about that from my own research is that most of the Jews in America that are doing circumcision aren't doing it in the traditional way, the ultra-Orthodox way is a very different procedure and than is done in the hospitals. Could you speak about that?
Right. So in the Jewish faith, circumcision has no value unless it is performed by a ritual practitioner known as a moil or someone like that. And certain prayers are recited and said. So if you are Jewish and you circumcise your child in a hospital, that's considered just surgery. It is not a religious practice. And some activists have argued it shouldn't be religiously protected in that context.
Mm-hmm.
But in traditional Jewish circumcision, so there's certain prayers that are recited. It's done on the 8th day. And among the Orthodox, there is something called Matzitza B'Peh, which is not only is the foreskin broken away from the glands, often even with like a long fingernail or something like that. But there is, after the foreskin is cut off, there's this thing called Matzitza B'Peh, where the practitioner, the religious moil, will suck the blood out of the wound. And I
The
think,
wound being the baby's penis. I want to be
right.
explicitly clear about that.
Well, and I think that a lot, like you can look this up online. There are pictures of this. And if you were to put your mouth on a child's genitals in any other context, it would be pedophilia and child abuse, and you would go to jail. Likewise, if you were to cut off any other part of a child's body, that would also be child abuse and you would go to jail. But because you are, or this practitioner is cutting off part of a child's body and then putting his mouth on his genitals in a religious context, then it's protected. And in fact, in this state of New York, there was a series of cases where a religious practitioner, a moil, gave newborn babies herpes.
I read about this, and he got away with it.
Because the state of New York, they wanted to regulate it, they wanted to prosecute, and the religious community got together, and the Orthodox Jews got together, and they said, this is our religious right, and we do not want any regulation of this at all. So,
but they'll regulate the size of a soda from a fountain machine.
Right. It's a very bizarre situation where, because this is religious and because Jewish people and Jewish groups have an immense amount of political power in this country, it's difficult for any politician to go against them, even when they're doing something as, explicit as giving herpes to newborn infants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's the kind of society we live in. It's all starting to come apart at the seams now. The people that watch the Fincastle Underground know how this is all going on with the scandal happening in the Catholic Church. A day of reckoning has come for people who have been posing as religious people. This is the fine distinction that we're going to have to make. People that have been masquerading as holy people and people that are genuine believers. And there have been, well, you read the papers as well as I do, everything going on with the Vatican and so on. The pedophilia is unbelievable. And this whole thing reeks of that, quite honestly. I know it's a deeply cherished religious tradition, but my God, what kind of people wind up in this role that they're going to suck the blood out of a baby's penis? Like how?
I tried to interview a number of moils for the film, and that was one of the few things. I called like 7 different moils and couldn't get one on camera. And one of the ones I called was one incident during that ballot initiative that we actually cover in the film.
Mm-hmm.
And I started into my pitch. I said, hi, my name is Brendon, and I'm doing a documentary on circumcision. I was just wondering if I could, and before I could finish, he was like, no, absolutely not. I was like, okay, well, do you mind me asking why you wouldn't want to talk about this on camera or in a film? And he said, because circumcision is going to be the abortion debate of the 21st century. And then he hung up on me. I was like, oh man, that would have been a good quote to get in the film. But I think it's true, because there's a sense in which this is my body, my rights for men. And on the case of abortion, people will debate whether or not the fetus is a person. But everyone agrees that a newborn infant who's come into this world, whose parents have decided to keep him, is a full human being and has all the rights of a full human being. And yet we still frame this as like, well, we can decide what body parts he gets to keep, when that is not true of a human being in any other context.
Right. That's interesting, because this is a hot topic socially now, is depersoning people, with the NPC, making people seem like they're not real human beings. You can make it look like you can reduce Republicans and Trump supporters down to this one-dimensional, that they're all Nazis. There's racism, things like that, sexism. But the real depersoning. The real dehumanization comes to the way we treat our own children, which I find fascinating. That's the very first to willingly turn your child over to a genital mutilator, to not even question, to not even question. That's the first dehumanization that happens, which is fascinating to me.
It's interesting to me too that when men protest circumcision, and I've heard of men who call up the doctor who did it to them and have a conversation with them and say, I'm not okay with what you did to me. People cannot connect the newborn infant they did this to with the adult who's talking to them. They
Right.
don't see that there's like been an obvious progression from one to the other, and they think, oh, those men are just weird. Not, oh, I actually had an interaction with those men when they were younger, or my profession did, or someone in my profession did, that they are now reacting to. That like causality is not linked because people do not see children, and especially babies, as full people yet.
Right. I think that plays into part of, we have a sort of retarded adolescence here, where adolescence lasting into your mid to late 20s. An entire generation of people that are basically social cripples. They can't function on their own. They don't have any real skill sets. They're basically like grown children because we've never, as a society, expected more from them. It's all connected. It's all tied together.
Yeah, when I talk about this issue, I'll try to focus just on the circumcision aspect because I don't want to overdose someone on red pills.
Right.
I don't want to, I find that this issue alone, however, is a big enough of a red pill that people start questioning other things. Because if they go, okay, well, if like this happened to me when I was young, what other things that we do around birth were not okay? What other industrialized systems that we have in our culture are not okay? What other things that happened to me when I was young might have impacted the person I am today? What other things that big cultural institutions do are they not honest about or are actually wrong? You start getting, it opens the door for these other questions. What things about how we treat men or how we treat gender are actually incorrect? Like there's this door for other questions that opens up.
Oh, absolutely. I think any thinking person should be asking those questions. And that's why I love my audience, and you're going to love my audience too. I'm sure you get a great response from them. Yeah, there's no shortage of questions like that with everything going on today. And the people that have the most to blame, have the most to gain from this, or that do gain the most financially, I thought was interesting with the obstetricians. They're the ones that are performing most of the circumcisions in America. It's not even pediatricians. It's
Right.
literally whoever can get to the penis first for profit.
Yeah, there's the whole industry around this is very strange. So there's a number of different people who have a financial incentive. There's the obstetricians in hospitals, which obstetricians are doctors of women's health. So why are women's doctors operating on men's genitals, right? And it's because they see it as a service performed for the mother. So we help you deliver the baby, and then we make sure your baby is the way that you want him to be, which even that is a little strange that they're surgically altering a child's genitals for the pleasure of his mother. Like there's something very, I think that would make a lot of people uncomfortable even in that framing of it. And so the hospitals and the obstetricians make money off it. There's the insurance. And actually, when it comes to insurance and Medicaid, one of the tactics that activists have used successfully is getting Medicaid to stop funding it. So if you're in a state where Medicaid funds circumcision, then you, the taxpayer, are funding some of this. And many people have had success calling up their politicians, calling up the people who are in charge of Medicaid, and saying, right now you're losing this much money funding circumcision, which isn't medically necessary, which a lot of people, which you don't have to. This is not something that we need to be funding. And you could save this much money. You could have this much more money in the government budget. And some bureaucrat or politician looks at that and goes, well, I like having money, and they just take it off the thing. So there's really simple ways like that people can actually make a difference.
Because it's all dollars and cents to them. They don't even see it as a human right.
Right. They're not even thinking about it on that level. There's also, when we're talking about groups that are making money on this, there are people who will sell the foreskin. So the foreskin has stem cells in it. and a lot of research groups and tissue banks are interested in buying that tissue. And actually, even there are skincare products that use foreskin cells in them.
Right. Oprah Winfrey was a big promoter of that, I believe.
Oprah Winfrey, Sandra Bullock, a number of people.
Right.
And again,
That's what makes this so dystopian. They're mutilating baby boys' genitals. Not only are there's like 100 different ways for them to make money for it. They're profiting off of it. They're basically harvesting sex organs from boys.
Right. And you were talking about like a war on men. You know, we have parts of men's sexuality that's being cut off and used to make women more beautiful, right? More physically young looking and attractive.
Mm-hmm.
I think if men were cutting off parts of female genitals and like turning them into steroids so they could get bigger and stronger, we would think that maybe, just maybe, there's a sexist element going on here, right?
Right.
But again, because it's men, because this part is framed as having no value, we sort of have cultural blinders to that.
Right. It's truly fascinating, and it's a litmus test of your own psyche to go through these mental exercises. Like I love when you do reversals like that. You know, if we were mutilating women's genitals and turning it into a product for men, that's always a good way of testing out something. If you put the shoe totally on the other foot, if it still sounds messed up or even more messed up, you probably shouldn't be doing it in the first place. So let's see here. What was tell me about some of the things that surprised you making this film. Was anything that caught you off guard?
I think the biggest thing that surprised me was the mental resistance people had to the issue. So I am someone who is always interested in learning the truth about things. I love learning new information. And I just sort of thought I would present this information and then people would get it. And you know, I just figured that the issue here was that this information had not been presented publicly and widely. And as I started working on the issue, I found people had a lot of resistance even to learning new information. Like I would just tell people, you know, I'd have a casual conversation. They'd say, what do you do? I'd say, I'm a filmmaker. They'd say, oh, that must be interesting. What are you working on? And I'd think like, all right, here we go. And I'd tell them I'm working on a documentary about circumcision. And you could see the reaction of like, people would unconsciously like guard their genitals. They would say, well, I'm fine with it. And they would like not want to hear anything else. It would like scare them to learn new information. And there would be like this weird projection and these like vicious attacks and things like that. And I just thought like, that's really strange because, you know, any other subject that you're fine with, that you're okay with, you're fine learning new information on, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm, you know, fine with like my diet and what I'm eating, but if someone told me that there was like a new superfood or something I could be doing that would be healthier, I'm open to hearing that, right? Mm-hmm. But with this issue, people are really scared to learn new information, and so I started seeing that there was a cognitive dissonance element to this, persuasion element, a human consciousness element, that this is something about people's identity. Like people actually make circumcision part of their identity. I am circumcised, right? Not circumcision is something that happened to me. You wouldn't say like, I'm tonsillectomied, right? That's not a part of your identity. You think that's just a surgery I might have had to do at some point. So because this unconsciously becomes part of people's identity, then it becomes part of their ego structure, and then they have to defend it. Because if you say that part of someone's ego is wrong, then you're, on some psychological level, they feel like you're saying they're wrong.
Particularly in the sexual sphere.
Oh, absolutely. It's like, I think that is the reason people make it an identity thing, because it does have to do with sexuality. And if they were to frame it as, you know, this is something that happened to me, then the other beliefs that someone has, like say about personal freedom or autonomy over your own body, that those might be the piece of their identity that they speak from when thinking about this issue.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned personal freedom. One of the things I noticed from the film and just from talking to you in the past is that nobody seems to really be against circumcision per se if the consenting adult wanted to do this to themselves. I think the real problem is that they're doing it to non-consenting infant children. That's what the activists want stopped. And on top of that, circumcision would have had an even more steady decline, except that there are a few very fervent pro-circumcision people that kind of keep stoking this issue. Because if I'm not mistaken, the AAP came out totally against circumcision in the 70s.
Right. Yeah. I want to jump back to the earlier point that you mentioned about how there's the personal choice element of this, because all the activists that I've talked to, they don't even necessarily want to ban circumcision as much as age restricted. So say you have to be at least 18, you have to be a consenting adult before you make surgical changes to your sexuality. And in fact, one of the people I interview in the film is a circumcised woman who chose to get female circumcision done, because she comes from a traditional African culture. She chose to get that done as an adult. And she will argue all the same things that circumcised men argue. She'll say, I'm cleaner, I'm healthier, my sexuality is better, I'm fine with it. And it's really interesting when people are presented with her perspective, because I can see the gears turning and they'll go, well, maybe she's okay with it, but women should have a choice over their own bodies. It's like, okay, yes, please continue with this line of logic.
Right. Extend that to men.
Right, right. But in terms of the institutions that are supporting this, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a policy statement at one point that said there's no medical reason for circumcision and we don't recommend it. And there was a backlash from some people within their group who'd been practicing this a long time. And so the next circumcision policy statement said the opposite. And there's been like a back and forth on their policy statements depending on who's in charge of the committee. There's also been a back and forth among various different larger bodies. So for example, the CDC at one point they had a new leadership under someone who is Jewish, who then all of a sudden their policy statement changed, and they were considering saying, well, we need to do circumcision to prevent STDs and HIV. Mm-hmm. And when people think of these large groups, they think that there's sort of some faceless organization, that there's an unbiased scientific committee working on this. They don't realize there's just a lot of internal politics, and it kind of depends who's in charge.
Oh, no, my viewers know better, particularly with the UN. The UN is supposed to be so prestigious, the United Nations. They're all dirtbags. They're all on the take somehow or another, getting paid off or on the grift or whatever. So, and that's what I'm saying earlier. Years ago, people would have thought doctors were God and that they were beyond reproach. But now people realize they're pretty shady people too in there. I mean, of course, there's good people everywhere. I don't want to paint it with a broad brush. But I think people now at this point in history understand that they're just people. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're not.
It's interesting too, because when you interview, like I interview multiple members of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and they'll all argue that they're totally unbiased. They are coming at this from a purely scientific perspective, and yet, two of the largest members I interview are Jewish, and one of them actually performed circumcision on his own child. So there's AAP ethical statements that say you shouldn't operate on family members, but to him this is a religious ceremony, so doesn't fall under that, and he did this to his child. And all of the research on persuasion, on cognitive dissonance, and human consciousness and how we perceive the world suggests that when there is a strong personal stake in an issue like that you can't really be unbiased, that you can't really be 100% objective, and that is going to influence your perception in some way.
Right.
Which, there's no one who's really truly unbiased in that case on this issue, because we all have, if you've had children or you are male, you have on some level had some unconscious persuasion applied to you on this issue. Either the bias of what your body is and what you know, or the bias of what you've chosen for your child. And if you've done the procedure, it's very difficult to say something I did was wrong. People don't like to be wrong. They don't like to admit they were wrong, and especially wrong on the level that this would indicate.
Well, there are doctors that have done that, though, to give credit where credit's due. There are doctors that have come out and said, I was a mutilator and I have to stop now.
Yeah, there are a number of them in our film. There are a number I've talked to. It's a significant number. But again, that requires, a certain level of moral courage, and it also requires being able to get over your own ego in some way.
Right. No, to be able to, that would be a tremendous test of character for a doctor to come out and say, no, I've been wrong. I've been hurting children. That's not easy to do. And is doctors opposing circumcision still active?
Yes, we interview them in our film.
Okay. I thought, I wanted to let anybody listening that might be involved in the medical profession, there is help out there if you want to become a conscientious objector and not participate in circumcisions. If you happen to work in the medical field or around newborn children, there are organizations out there that will support you. You could get sued ultimately. I think that is very much on the horizon in the next 10 years or so. Once people really understand, not only was I damaged, I can go after the hospital.
We actually interviewed someone who did a circumcision lawsuit in our film. So if you're curious, I think that interview subject is a really interesting character.
Right. You do have the very most interesting characters in your film.
We do.
It takes that sort of intellect, though, to really grasp the situation. That's not something that we should understate either. People have been against circumcision probably since as long as the procedure's gone on. But some of the early activists, like in the 70s, they took so much heat for coming out and saying this. You know, now it's easy. You can retweet and share and click like and everything's good and you're an activist. But these people lost everything. Many of them lost their jobs, their careers, their livelihood, just to stand up and say, no, you should not be mutilating children. It was a radical thing for them to do.
And that's the way that all social justice movements or human rights movements begin. When you look at the early civil rights leaders, they took an incredible amount of heat. They were arrested. They had police and fire hoses turned on them. Mm-hmm. And now, you know, you would be seen as a very bad person to disagree with the ideas that they were suggesting about equality. Likewise, this is true. Been true of the rights movement. This has been true to a certain degree of aspects of the women's movement. I feel like that there is a similar thing happening here, where the ideas that the intactivist, intact plus activist movement, the movement to keep children and human beings intact and allow them to have the whole body. I feel like the ideas that they were pushing were initially very controversial to American society, but they were also trying to talk to a society that wasn't yet comfortable talking openly about sexuality, that wasn't yet comfortable talking.
They couldn't even talk openly about divorce at that time.
Oh yeah, I mean there were much more social taboos, and so in some way the fact that we are capable of having an open conversation about all of these sort of taboo topics has laid groundwork for the movement. And then on top of that, the fact that we can now share information more readily. So instead of having to go through, mainstream television and newspapers, we can do something like this, or we can do podcasts or YouTube, or in my case, produce a film.
Right.
It's a lot easier.
No, right. I remember it was either the 60s or the 70s or 80s, somewhere within a near part of my lifetime before they could even show a pregnant woman on television to depict a woman in pregnancy on TV. So we've had a quantum leap of communication with the internet. And go ahead.
Well, on that subject, actually, I find this really interesting. There was a movie a couple years back called What to Expect When You're Expecting. Mm-hmm. And in it, the couple, like one of the things that they have is the couple has a debate over circumcision. And they could not avoid, it was either an R or an NC-17 rating. They would get one of those ratings if they even explained what circumcision was. So just saying that circumcision involves cutting off part of the penis, NC-17 R rating, your movie is going to not reach as many people in theaters. And it's funny because when I was, when we were getting ready to put this film out, one of the questions that the group I was working with to distribute the film asked is like, what, if you were to get a rating, like what rating would it be? And I was like, I have no idea. I mean, I feel like should be G or PG, because if this is okay to do to children, it should be okay to talk about to young people. But
no, we're in the society where you can't even tell a kid the proper name penis before they're like in adolescence. You can't even call it a penis; it's a PP or something.
Right.
So no, it's very interesting. We're still living in the Victorian age in many ways.
I feel like it's mixed. It's like as William Gibson said, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet.
Right. Some people are living well in the future with human potential, and you can have as much or as little as you want now with technology. There's so much to learn. You just have to go out and take it. Well, let's talk more about the film. There was it truly is a classic movie. It's gonna change a lot of people. It's going to be I'm certain of it. I know it's going to be one of those things where people pass it around. You might not even want to hear this, but I bet you people are going to be burning copies of this movie just to share with their friends. That's unavoidable for any media type. But this is going to be really important. I can imagine that once people see it, they're not going to be able to help but show it to somebody else. So it's an idea whose time has come. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you learned during this process? Any of the people you met? Anything tangential?
So I feel like one of the things that's important to talk about is the alternatives that exist for circumcised men. Because I think when you share a message like this, there's the potential for it to just be a giant downer. Like, this thing happened to you and now it's bad and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's what I thought when I initially started learning about the subject. And it's one of the reasons it took me a while to actually do the research and learn this, because I just thought, well, if there's nothing I can do about it, why think about it, right? And one of the first things that I discovered when I was willing to research it was something called foreskin restoration, where men will take the remaining skin that they have and stretch it over time so that there is a covering of the glands of the penis again.
Mm-hmm.
And these men report that this actually increases a lot of sexual sensation. So the fine nerve endings that are in the foreskin, you can't get back, but you can get back the covering of the glands and the gliding motion of the foreskin. So you get back some of the form and function of the foreskin. And there's one guy who, I wasn't able to put him in the film, but he's sort of a legend among foreskin restoration groups, who said that he was circumcised as an adult. So he had had sex with his intact foreskin, was circumcised, found that there was a dramatic reduction in sensation, and then did restoration. And what he said was that intact, it was a 10, circumcised, it was a 3, and restored, it was a 7. So if you are circumcised and you're interested in restoration, you can get a lot of sensation back. And there's one guy we interview in the film who makes restoration devices. And he had a client who could not have children because he didn't have enough sensitivity to orgasm and finish in his wife. And after restoration, he was able to. So it is, in some cases, that dramatic a change. And then beyond that, because that's obviously a huge step up for men. And I think men, a lot of the time, when they want to heal something, they want to find something they can do. They don't necessarily want to just do talk therapy or pontificate on it. They want some action they can take. And a lot of men have said that gave them the healing and action they needed.
Right, and many men are doing it. There's nobody knows exactly what the number is, but it's an underground movement.
It is, because there's no statistics on this, right? Like, a man who gets a restoration device isn't in some registry. He's not necessarily going to tell anyone publicly he's doing this.
But those things are selling like hotcakes. They're on eBay all the time.
The guy I interview, he supports his family of 4, just making devices like this, and he had done some surveys, and the closest estimate he was able to get was that there's 250,000 men doing this worldwide.
Right.
But it could be more, because again, like, he only has access to the stats that he has.
Right, for his one company, and there's countless people doing this.
And I think beyond that, there is a potential in the future to use something like regenerative medicine to regrow this part of the body. So there's already been cases around the world of people using stem cells to regrow body parts. Like, there's someone who had his whole finger cut off and he was able to regrow the finger. There was a team in Hong Kong who regrew the inside of a woman's vagina, which, when you think about like regrowing body parts, I would argue that the inside of a woman is as complex as the foreskin. Although there are some people who say the foreskin is so densely innervated, it's more complex than that. But the point is that this technology exists already. And there are people in the world who are working on it. There's an organization called Forgen that's trying to do research to solve this topic. Mm-hmm. But the technology may actually already exist. It just hasn't been implemented to this part of the body.
Right.
And I think that in the future, there is the potential, if enough people are interested in restoring this part of the body, if there is a collective interest from human consciousness from it for that to happen. But we'd have to reach a critical mass of people who want that to be done, who are demanding that that be done, who are asking that this technology be applied in this way. And we'd have to get enough funding to do that. So enough people with money who are also interested in doing this. But again, that could just take a number of people, or it could take one really rich person who's like, As one of my interview subjects said, I was born with a foreskin. I want to die with a foreskin. Who's practicing restoration. Like, it just requires enough interest and enough raising of the consciousness for people to find the solution to this problem. But I think people have been reluctant to go into that consciousness because they're afraid that if they do, it's hopeless, there's nothing they can do, when in reality, being willing to feel that initial feeling of hopelessness or see how big the problem is what's going to allow people to find the solution to this issue.
Right. No, I think a lot of people can resonate with that. There's big problems going on in all spheres of life. This is just another one. Now that you're aware of it, it's something that you definitely should tackle.
And it's a very easy solution. If you're becoming a parent, there's one less thing you have to worry about. Like, it's actually quite simple.
Right. No, it's sad because it would take at least a generation for people to become educated on how the actual natural male anatomy works in this country. There's no, when I was in college, I would always go through the anatomy and physiology books, and there was no competent discussion of the foreskin as an organ, and it is an organ of its own right. So, well, what else? Is there anything on the horizon for you right now? I think we've covered about everything. We've covered a lot. I always enjoy these conversations with you because they run the gamut of everything.
Yeah, I would just say, if you want to see the film, check it out, circumcisionmovie.com. I'm starting to think about next projects, and one of the things that this film has made me really curious about is human consciousness and how people are persuaded of things, how the mind actually works. And I think I've found some subject matter that will allow me to explore that in the next project.
Well, it's going to be fascinating. You're already an award-winning filmmaker, and you're just getting started. I'm totally serious to everybody watching. Brendon is the next big thing. You're going to want to keep an eye on him. He's going to be doing some really great work. I know that he loves liberty as much as the rest of us do. He's very patriotic and happy to be working in America, of all the places he could be. What else for you? There's got to be something else going on that you wanted to talk about.
I could talk about this issue for hours and hours, at least 100 hours of documentary footage, which actually soon we're going to have on the website all the bonus features, and so you'll be able to see full interviews with all of my different people I've talked to, bonus stuff, deleted scenes. So that all is all going to be only on the website.
Right. That's going to be great. Any one of those films would be like an academic lecture in and of itself. I'm sure each one would be packed with so much information. Was it difficult editing this? Because I'm sure that everything mine.
Yes, it was difficult. Yeah, I mean, the challenge of it is that I actually feel like you could do a whole documentary on any one part of this issue. So you could do a whole documentary just on the sexuality. You could do a whole documentary just on foreskin restoration. You could do a whole documentary just on the history of circumcision. And what I wanted to do with the film was take people from ignorant to expert in under 2 hours. So if you know nothing about circumcision going in, if you there's one person who appears early on the film, an elderly man who walks up to an activist and asks him, so does circumcision remove tissue? I thought it was just an incision. Like, this man's in his 60s and he doesn't even know this basic fact of his anatomy.
Mm-hmm. And many people don't.
Yeah, so the goal of the film is just to give people that introduction, and then all the bonus material we have is if you just really want to go deep on it, if you want to know everything about everything. It's also so that if someone says, oh, you were unfair in the editing, it's like, here's all the footage, like anything you want to hear people say, you can watch any particular interview subject you found interesting, talk for like an hour just about their expertise. So it'll all be there.
Oh, no, there is so much to go into. We didn't even touch on one of the things I wanted to talk about, but I'm not sure we'll have time right now, is the clinical trials in Africa, how the Clinton Foundation was pushing free circumcisions for all over there and basically making a mockery of the scientific process. Maybe we can talk about it.
Well, that could have been, again, its own documentary. So there were a series of trials in Africa that were used to argue that male circumcision prevents HIV. And in the first version of the sequence I had on that, it was like an hour long, because most people read that, they read the headline, they go, well, I'm circumcised, glad to hear that, good job, moving on. and they don't really go into the data, and many people don't have the academic training to go into that data.
Mhm.
But when you go into the data, there is a whole lot of, potential errors and things to talk about. And there's also a lot of money flowing through these programs. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the larger human rights question. There have been studies to suggest that female circumcision, that women who are circumcised have lower rates of HIV, but the researchers have always abandoned those studies because they don't want to give any ammunition to pro-female circumcision groups.
Right. They never publicized those.
Right, and people, even if that was true, I think most people would say, well, even if it does prevent HIV, women have the right to their own body, and that supersedes any preventative effect.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the HIV trials, more people left the study than stayed in it. They were done in Africa, which is a very different setting than the United States. They never even apply to the United States. And they were also done in conditions where, there's certain things you can't ethically do in the United States when it comes to medical trials.
Oh, no, that's why they've always used Africa as their personal petri dish.
Right. And so one of the things you can't do is offer large amounts of money to the people that you're doing your trial on. And in the case of these trials, they offered what was the equivalent of like $10,000 of free healthcare. So again, ethically, you probably couldn't get away with that in the United States, but in Black Africa, you can. And it also, when I was working on the film, I wanted to interview an African person who was involved on this issue over there. And when I started talking to him, one of the things he initially did was he hit me up for money. He said, well, can I get paid for the interview? And it occurred to me that there was like a large power disparity between us, because he, coming from Africa, did not have a lot of wealth. Mm-hmm. And I understood why he wanted to get paid for that. But I also knew that if I did that, that would spike any interview I did with him. Because
right, that would invalidate your findings.
Yeah, he was the kind of person who, if I gave him money and told him to say something on camera, he would say anything I wanted on camera. Mm-hmm. And so the amount that he asked me for was far less than they were offering in these trials. And then they'll look at the self-reported data from these trials, which says, oh, I'm fine with my circumcision. I'm totally happy with it. Sex is way better. And they'll say, well, see, men are, they'll use these trials, which were done on HIV, to talk about the sexual impact of circumcision and say, well, that's fine. But they also gave the equivalent of, $10,000 to everyone who did the study, with this massive power disparity, and then amazingly got the result that they wanted from self-reported study.
Right, so it's funny how that happens.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then you look at the amount of money that's flowing through these studies too. One of the pieces of footage that you can see in our trailer is Hillary Clinton, on behalf of PEPFAR, when she was Secretary of State, pledging $40 million to these circumcision programs. So the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has given a lot of money to them. The Clinton Foundation has given a lot of money to them. PEPFAR, so you, the taxpayer, have given a lot of money to them. And they're doing these circumcisions in places that don't even have clean water. So it's like, of all the things that could be potentially contributing to disease there, it seems like clean water might be a higher priority. But the money is there for the circumcision studies for some strange reason. So right. You could really do, there's a journalistic expose to be done in those studies that hasn't been done yet, because the people who would do those studies, or that research, that journalism, are mostly circumcising Americans. And they look at it, and they look at the people involved, and they're, very prominent groups, and they're doing this to prevent HIV. And so if you do an expose on them, you're saying that, groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation and all of the preventing HIV groups and WHO, you're saying that somehow they're corrupt and bad, and you would be slammed as, anti-Semitic and
right.
Again, which they're not religious at all, but you'd have that thrown at you, right?
Right. Well, fortunately, my audience knows better, and some people, in spite of everything we've talked about, all they need to hear is that Hillary Clinton was promoting circumcision, and they'll know it's
right.
bad. So you're saying that Hillary Clinton was trying to get $40 million for circumcision?
Oh, not trying. That was how much PEPFAR gave.
Oh, she got it. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't even Again, like actually, I shouldn't say that because I'm not familiar with the internal political process by which it was done,
Mm.
but it was done.
It
And
changed hands somehow. The money was it got there.
yes,
Right. No, that's all you really need to say. I wouldn't say any more. You might decide to shoot yourself in the back of the head tomorrow. This could be the last interview you ever do. So,
they haven't gotten me yet, so I think I'm all right.
no, that's absolutely terrifying. It's like, oh yeah, a study shows Lucky Charms is good, paid for by General Mills, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. I think people see how that kind of thing works. Well, I mean, gee, I could keep talking to you. I'd have no idea how long we've been on already. It's been worth it. We'll do one final thoughts for
Okay.
real.
Okay. Is there a particular topic you want final thoughts on, or just
No,
general final thoughts?
no, just whatever final thoughts. I mean, this is a big deal, and we've kind of made light of some of it, but truly, it's a human tragedy. And I like the fact that you ended on a positive note that there is hope. But what are you hoping? What would be a really great outcome for you when people see this film?
My goal with the film has always been just to present people with the information they're not aware of. And my hope is that it causes people to think, that it allows them to explore whatever thoughts or feelings they might have about circumcision, that it helps them to raise their future children with more safety and love, and that, my hope is that it sort of allows people to also ask those larger questions about this issue. I think a lot of the time when circumcision is presented, it's presented as a one-time decision that the parents make that you never have to think about again. And I see it as a human issue. It's more like throwing a stone in a pond, and this decision ripples out through that person's life, through their sexuality, through their body, through their relationship to their family, through cultural institutions, through religion and medicine and politics. And my hope is that this film is a similar effect. This one piece of media ripples out through people's minds, through their choices, through their future children, through their willingness to question other issues and explore the world and explore their own feelings, and that it acts as a catalyst for all those other things.
Well,
And that in the future, when someone's having a kid, this is like, well, you got to see this film.
yeah, if they see that, if they take the trouble to watch this film, all of those things will happen. You can't help but be changed by having seen this film. And I'm a pretty gritty guy. I've been around a lot of crazy things, and my mind is. I've studied all sorts of things, but watching this film truly puts a unique perspective on things that I thought I even had a handle on. So I can't recommend it enough. But anyways, I will be back in the future with some more Fincastle Underground episodes for my audience. Today, we've had Brendon Marotta on. We're going to have his links and things down in the description so you could follow him. And I would encourage that you do follow him on social media and take the time to watch this video. It's a very big red pill. Thank you for being with us today, Brendon.
Thank you.